Paris Agreement is a result of the changing world. Firstly, why it is global? Because climate change is global. Generation capacity, electricity generation capacity in China is bigger than the rest of the world put together. The farmers keep the keys to the future sustainable and secure development. We always have to keep in mind that it is about economy. It is about sustainability. It is about making the world a livable place, not just for us, but also for the generations to come.
Welcome to our Carbon Farming Odyssey, a journey across uncharted territories where soil is not just earth, but a living asset. Together, we set sail across the vast ocean of sustainable agriculture, mapping new value chains and covering hidden opportunities, cooperating and cultivating the future of farming.
In today's episode, we welcome Tomasz Chruszczow, many years negotiator, climate expert, a true explorer of climate safety, with experience from many fields and many institutions. Tomasz brings insight into how to cope with our climate, how to help to mitigate the changes, and also how to shape the landscapes, our economy, and our climate resilience. Let's dig in. The adventure begins now. Tomasz, it's really great to host you today in the Institute of Soil Science and Plant Cultivation, State Research Institute, where we can hear from outside, for example, peacocks. I'm just, at the beginning, giving some insight from where the voices can come. And because I know that you have a very huge experience, and you had many roles helping to negotiate many of changes which could happen possibly or have happened. At the beginning, I would like to ask you about your experience and also about your journey, which has started on some point, and now we can talk together about what we can do together, or what the governments do to help mitigate climate change.
Well, if I knew all the answers to the questions you raised, that would mean that we have no problems any longer. Unfortunately, those answers are not that easy to put together, and my experience in this negotiating process of climate change proves it. I spent dozens or so years in climate change convention, trying to as efficiently as possible represent our country in the convention. I was many years the head of negotiations on behalf of Poland, and also spent a couple of years as the so-called convention officer, presiding over the subsidiary bodies that were negotiating certain decisions that, after final adoption by the Conference of Parties, became effective and had to be implemented by all the parties to the convention. But when we say parties, we understand the governments who are signatories to the Climate Change Convention. And I must say, this is one of those UN bodies, UN treaties, that nearly every single country on the planet have signed to, and all the government representatives, usually on the level of ministers, and recently also on the level of heads of states, meet annually and try to assess what is the current state of climate action, what needs to be additionally done, and how successful we were in what we have committed to in the previous years. So that's why I can proudly say that I have experienced many various changes in the convention and had this privilege of attending meetings on various topics, well, including the topic of adaptation, including the topic of nature-based solutions that could be implemented in order to, firstly, better adapt, secondly, to use the so-called mitigation co-benefits, but also to achieve what seems to be, and well, not only seems, which is the overriding priority of the convention, which means eradication of poverty and hunger. That's the top priority of climate convention.
So exactly at the beginning, I think it's good to start from raising the question: what exactly is the Paris Agreement, and how it was elaborated and signed, because it was a kind of huge effort of governments of countries. So maybe for our listeners, you can make it a more clear introduce.
So Paris Agreement in a nutshell, yeah. Paris Agreement is a result of the changing world. Climate Change Convention has been agreed in 1992, came into force in 1995, and in 1995 we had the first conference of parties. The first conference of parties met in Berlin in June or July, I don't remember, 1995, presided over by that time Minister of Environment of Germany, who was Madame Angela Merkel. So she was the first president of the Conference of the Parties of the Climate Change Convention. It has been agreed in 1992, but the negotiations started a little bit earlier, and the provisions of the convention, and in particular the division of countries into two large groups, developed and developing, was kind of a photography of that time world, of the world from the early 90s of the last century, were so-called developed countries, and in particular that time OECD countries like the US, Canada, Australia, western part of Europe, was by far more developed, manufacturing by far more than many other countries, including today manufacturing hubs for the world like China or India. And when we started to think what needs to be done in order to bring much more action to this convention, nearly everybody realized that this division into developed and developing dated back from early 90s of the previous century is simply outdated. It's not reflecting the real impact that economies are making on climate, on the well-being of the world. Well, the division of value chains was completely different. The initiative occurred, well, let's start thinking of something that would bring all countries together, not just developed, but also those developing who are now becoming the manufacturing hubs for the world, into single treaty that would include them on kind of equal level and make them act together. Well, of course, there is this principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. Of course, there are certain provisions that are, well, not being changed. Nobody was thinking of changing the convention itself, but the developing of the new mechanism, how to engage everybody into this single treaty, became particularly important when preparing for 2009 15th Conference of the Parties in Copenhagen. Well, the result was not very good. It was no agreement, and in 2011, and that is interesting year from our Polish point of view, because that was the time when we were playing for the first time the role of the presidency of the Council of the European Union. So Poland back in 2011 was presiding over the EU during the negotiations in the 17th Conference of Parties, which took place in Durban, in South Africa. So that was important for us to be able to proudly announce to the world that after the conference, the world agreed to start negotiating, to start thinking on the single treaty that would be a legal instrument that would be applicable to all. And this applicable to all and this legal force of this treaty were two most important sentences in the decision of the Durban COP. Then 2 years later, well, a year later, the world decided to extend the commitment period of Kyoto Protocol, and in 2013, again, very important year for Poland, the Conference of Parties took place in Warsaw, the 19th conference in the year 2013. And this conference decided that we should allow countries of the world to take sovereign decisions upon their contributions to global climate action. And that's how this concept of initially intended nationally determined contribution, which finally got converted in Paris into nationally determined contributions, was brought to the table of negotiations. So the most challenging, the most contentious issue in the negotiations, which was who should tell me or that gentleman what they need to do, disappeared, because nobody was going to tell anybody what to do. Each country was supposed to take sovereign, independent decision and decide, following their own constitutional rules, what would be their contribution. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so the first feature of Paris Agreement was the decision that every action is the result of the nationally determined contribution. The second very important issue in Paris Agreement is that eventually adaptation became a very important goal for the treaty, for the countries, because Paris Agreement is an international treaty. And the third goal, not just mitigate emissions, but also adapt. And the third goal, make sure that there is enough assistance, there are sufficient means of implementation offered to developing countries, particularly those least developed, to make them catch up with what is happening in the world, to allow them not to follow all the same steps that we were taking in our history of development. Third issue was that we agreed that we will be as possible transparent, that we need transparency as the proof of good intentions and as the tool to communicate how countries or groups of countries, like the European Union, for instance, are fulfilling their voluntarily taken obligations.
Mm-hmm. It was very interesting to hear about this, insight and how did you bring the all of the steps which were before the Paris Agreement. I think it's very important.
Yeah, because it came from the as a logical result of the number of developments, steps forward, some steps back, and then again forward as usual, but it is the result of the evolution of thinking.
Mm-hmm. You have mentioned about the cooperation. You have mentioned about the global cooperation. Why do we need exactly a global reunion cooperation between the countries to cope with climate change? So this is my question now for you, and how the Paris Agreement help to do so. And secondly, this what is raised very often when we have lots of tensions today, wars. And many of citizens and also some of the experts raise the issue that there is no place for fighting with climate change, for actions to help to mitigate the climate change. That we should focus on the defense of our countries and so on. So please focus on that.
That's a very good question. Let me put it this way. Firstly, why it is global? Because climate change is global. So that's the perfect example of how the development in one particular point on the globe affects everybody else. Because all the emissions, all the changes in the ecosystems, let's start from saying what is the climate system of the planet. Because many people confuse climate with weather. Weather is very nice today.
Beautiful. I can say.
Climate is the whole of atmosphere, hydrosphere, geosphere, and biosphere, and interconnections and interlinkages between all those spheres. So when we talk about climate, we must keep in mind that we are not just talking about the emissions. We are talking about the biosphere, its health, and its ability to regenerate, its ability to stay in balance with all the other spheres, including hydrosphere, geosphere, and atmosphere. When we talk about geosphere, we need to look carefully which are the interconnections. Well, if we poison the soil, immediately biosphere suffers. If we do something wrong to our water reservoirs, well, the total of water in the system will be preserved because it circulates. Mm-hmm. But we will lose the water that is needed exactly here. And we have already experienced this kind of changes where the rains that were supplying water to the fields, to arable lands, well, moved into the sea. So they are now supplying the ocean with clean water. So these are the changes in climate. So these changes are global, and only global action can help. What is also more important to understand and remember that all the goals of Paris Agreement are the global goals. Mm-hmm. And the mechanism has been introduced in Paris Agreement, which is being called the global stocktake, which is the meeting and discussion of all parties to Paris Agreement, which takes place every 5 years. Well, the first took place in 2023, so the next is coming in 2028. And the idea of this global stocktake is to have a careful look into the results of all the actions that parties committed themselves to contribute to the global well-being or improvement of climate. And this is why in Climate Change Convention there is that strongly underlined that we need to take care of forests, that we need to take care of land use, that we need to take care of the social awareness of the problem. So what we now usually call ecological education. This is also inscribed in the convention and also in Paris Agreement.
Yes, so now I would like to ask you, what is the position and also the role and how the Paris Agreement has impact on agriculture? I mean, because we know that it's a kind of like as you said, that we have to think globally, but also we have like intersectoral approach. Yeah? So we focus on different sectors which are somehow, like responsible, which has an impact on the climate. So where is the agriculture in this, broad picture, and also how the Paris Agreement impact the agriculture sector?
I mentioned at the beginning that food security and combating hunger is the so-called overriding priority of the convention. Therefore, it's an overriding priority of Paris Agreement. This is why it was very difficult to start discussions that would directly be addressing the issue of agricultural emissions, agricultural environmental impacts, because in particular developing countries, well, the biggest developing countries like India, like Bangladesh, but also countries of South America and African countries, were very sensitive and very anxious not to engage into the discussion that could result in some kind of limitations that would be put upon them. So, as a matter of fact, before Paris Agreement, people were very reluctant to discuss agriculture within the official agenda of the negotiations. Well, we had various informal meetings, some informal expert discussions, but we had to keep in mind that these discussions would not be brought to the official agenda because of this reluctancy, because of this, well, let's call it directly fears of developing countries that somebody would affect their food security. Paris Agreement was possible not only because people agreed that something additional has to be done. Paris Agreement was possible because certain level of mutual trust between the parties has been developed, and this trust was instrumental in eventual arriving at the decision 2 years later, in 2017 in Bonn, in the COP that was presided over by Fiji. And the decision was taken to start so-called work program. The work program, which means within the official agenda of climate negotiations, discussion has been allowed about how to include agriculture in this entire global equation. And let's not forget that having this adaptation goal in Paris Agreement, having very carefully structured Article 5 in Paris Agreement, which provided for development and enhancing of so-called carbon stocks, the ability of biosphere, of biosystems to absorb and keep carbon permanently, either within the trees or in soil. These were all these tiny elements that eventually helped parties to arrive at this decision that included agriculture. Before that, it was in fact impossible. It's only the very beginning. Well, the processes in the UN are very slow. Well, if we take into account that nearly 200 countries take part in this process, that is always the difficulty, because the principle of decision making in this convention and in the entire UN system is that it has to be consensus. Mm-hmm. And consensus means that nobody opposes. Yes. It does not mean that everybody agrees. It does not mean that everybody is happy. But no objection means that everybody can live with that.
To fulfill the goals, objectives of every of a strategy or like a regulation, we look for some tools or some actions. One of the hot topic currently related to agriculture is a kind of like a proposition of carbon certificates or carbon credits, and this is kind of like market-based mechanism. And I would like to ask you, as the expert, what do you think about this kind of cooperation, like market-based mechanisms, and if it can help really to somehow push farmers to implement some of the activities, practices. As you remember from our last workshop, we presented some of the activities and some of the practices which are less impactful on soil, or for example, helps to produce yield in more sustainable way. There are probably many of the mechanisms like this in other sectors, but it's very often said today that it can be very helpful, for example, if the farmers are paid some of the money, some subsidy, based on their involvement actions. So what is your opinion about that?
We still have problems with malnutrition, which is one of the biggest developmental challenges for the world. But comparing to what we and what the world experienced, well, I cannot say we have never experienced this kind of disaster. But at that time, that seemed to be, well, the holy grail of agriculture. And then people started to realize that there is a price, which is not just additional expenditure to buy these chemicals, but this is the price that the nature pays, that the soil pays, and the soil, over-fertilized, over-treated with herbicides, lost its fertility. And also the emissions related to this, both manufacturing and use of these chemicals, started to be significant. So we realized that maybe it's not the only way, and we need to start thinking of the long-term health of the soil rather than short-term results of additional assisted farming. And this is where we are now. The statistics are that we are wasting, just enormous amounts of food for many reasons. In our part of the world, it's because of the excessive consumption. In the poorer part of the world, because the industry, food processing and food storage is not developed or not supplied with energy, so this food is being wasted. So instead of wasting food, let's maybe start using more sustainable farming procedures. Let's invest in food processing, food storing, and let's achieve better soil, healthier soil. Let's achieve human development in these countries, because people who would be using these sustainable farming methods would need to be trained, so that we will have better educated societies, and we will have better developed new sectors or subsectors of economy. And when we sometimes discuss the climate convention, people start asking, well, but where is the environment? Where is climate? Well, climate, environment is the result of better economy. So if we talk about the convention, if we talk about the environmental treaties, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Convention to Combat Desertification, we always have to keep in mind that it is about economy. It is about sustainability. It is about making the world a livable place, not just for us, but also for the generations to come. So that's why it was so important to include adaptation in Paris Agreement. Well, before that, what you could hear from many people, they used to say, well, adaptation is it's bullshit. It's the invitation to emit more. Adaptation is invitation to emit more. No. Adaptation is the foundation for investing in sustainable economy. Adaptation is investment in food security. It's investment into existential security of people. The emissions and those cumulated emissions in the atmosphere will result in continuation of the rising temperature. So even if we stop emitting in 1 second, no more emissions, the temperature will continue to go up.
Yeah, definitely. Some of the mechanisms we cannot stop, and also the issue is to somehow be ready for the changes, also to know how to manage the water, how to produce, for example, the species which are less impactful on, who can better adapt to what we have outside, to temperature, but also
will be equally resistant to floods and extreme heat.
Distribution of a precipitation as well, because as you said, we have many less times rains, but they are heavier and they quicker run off from the watershed to the sea. So my question is, because sometimes I think that European Union is a kind of like an island with our own regulations and some objectives, and then we have China, we have United States, who are not so conservative in the steps, but maybe this is just
no, they are conservative.
They are conservative.
We are not.
We are not. Okay. Okay. So please let you share what do you think about the current actions taken by the European Commission, also some ideas which they propose, and I'm talking about the direction after the Paris Agreement, after 10 years after, and what is your opinion about the current state?
Well, I think that in general, the goals has been set in Paris. So we need to achieve a balance between the emissions and sinks by the end of this century. And we have to stop the rise of temperature. And the rise of temperature means that average temperature on the surface of the planet. It's not the temperature on Wednesday and Friday next week. It's the average temperature on the planet. And this is what is being driven by climate change. So my only reservation is, and that's the question that I keep asking, is that if we have fully taken into account that, well, the EU is big, economically powerful group of countries, it's one of the richest regions of the world, but I'm not sure if when designing the entire system, the whole world was properly taken into account. And there is a very interesting report that was published in the Financial Times like 3 days ago about coal. The investments in new generation capacity, electricity generation capacity in China, is bigger than the rest of the world put together. Should we continue with coal? Well, I'm not sure, but I'm also not sure where we would take the energy from, because well, and it's not the question where this energy would be coming from in 50 years or 100 years. Well, the only honest answer is I don't know. We'll hopefully develop something by far more efficient and cleaner than what we have now. But if we are talking about 10, 15, 20 years perspective, then we have to be very precise and very realistic. And we have to take into account the current geopolitical situation, which is not good, as we know. So the questions, the issue of security, including energy security, is an issue that needs to be addressed. And of course, I'm not going to say, well, it's a difficult time, so let's do nothing. No. Quite in contrary. In this time, just because it's so difficult, we need much more focused action to achieve our energy independence, to build up our food security, to scale up our development and implementation of clean, sustainable technologies, to make sure that we are fully independent. Well, it's interesting if you start thinking how would, well, this famous environmental social governance be applicable to all of the economy rather than to selected businesses. Because if we think about this environmental social governance standards, ESG, it's nothing new. It's what is E, environmental? Well, you have to follow the standards. You have to follow the regulations about the industrial emissions, about agriculture. Everything is in this. Everybody is included. What is social? Well, let's be decent employer. Let's be decent employees. It's about working according to the rules. So, as a matter of fact, what people lamented about was this additional bureaucratic obligation to prepare the reports rather than rejecting the standards of environmentally sound management, environmentally sound technologies, and, well, surprise, surprise, just obeying the law. So there is nothing new in this, just additional reporting obligation that was too difficult, too demanding, and too costly. Mm-hmm. So it's very good that the Commission finally and the member states decided that we have to make it easy implementable rather than that expensive and that costly. Mm-hmm. And what I want to say is that, as a matter of fact, every single sector of economy, every single organization, every single self-government, every single gmina, powiat, whatever, should think of this ESG as of the approach to management, approach to quality assurance, approach to law-obeying assurance, etc., etc. It's, you know, some people who remember Mr. Molière and his drama about Monsieur Jourdain. It's what's the English title of this drama? It's Bourgeois Nobel or something like this.
Everyone knows, yeah.
Yeah, and Mr. Jourdain was so surprised that his everyday speech is prose. Mm-hmm. Well, we should be equally surprised that what we do is, if we follow the law, if we follow the rules, if we want to innovate, if we want to be efficient in businesses and efficient in managing the for instance, territories, cities. Mm-hmm. We are speaking the prose because it is ESG.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you touched a very interesting aspect, which is like a complexity of the system. Mm-hmm. That there are many elements, and mm-hmm. You know, sometimes I also think that the goal is to take care of our resources and also find a way to be competitive, even if the other countries are not taking care of actions which support, like, you know, support not to increase the temperatures. And I think that some intersectoral cooperation, as we do, for example, as we try to do in our National Bioeconomy Hub, when we try to put together many of the experts from different sectors and try to also go out from the silos which they stay are. I'm talking about the biogas producers who not fully understand what is happening in the biofuel sector or the competition between the resources in the agricultural sector. So based on your expertise and also your really huge knowledge about how to negotiate and also, this is my opinion, how to negotiate and how to talk, yeah? What would you recommend to build some, you know, alliances, some cooperations between people who have different mindset, who can somehow change the mindset, listening others? What would you recommend in this difficult time now when we have tensions and so on, to boost the cooperation, coming to the common goals?
Well, I think you've just given the answer, because you said listen to each other, and this is number one. Unless we listen to each other, it will be no agreement. It will be no cooperation. So first, carefully listen. Because when you listen, you show respect. When you listen, you have the chance to better comprehend, understand, and conclude, and maybe build on what you have understood. Second, you have to be convinced that unless we cooperate, we won't do anything. So we have to cooperate. So listen to each other and be willing to cooperate. And the third thing, be ready for accepting. Be ready for accepting that somebody could simply think differently, and maybe his or her different opinion could help you to develop something better. So these are three kind of prime rules that you need to develop and implement when you start talking about each other. If there is a agreement that we met here to agree upon something, this is the first precondition. Then listen to each other and try to and this is the role of the person who's chairing such conversation. Firstly, to listen. Second, to extract from what he or she hears which are the points that are common. And when we put all these commonalities together, well, we suddenly see, well, maybe we cannot have agreement on everything, but we have a very good base. Sometimes we call it landing zone. We have very good base for starting cooperation. Because we came here to agree upon cooperation. We may not be happy to cooperate on everything, like people were happy to cooperate on energy industry and other industries, but they were reluctant to discuss agriculture. Now they are discussing agriculture. We have arrived at this point, eventually. And that's probably the way to proceed with every group of people, with every topic, big or small, on global level or on regional level. The rules are the same, and people simply want to be heard. People simply want to be sure that their interests are taken into account. If they see even small piece of what is important for them in this final something that appears from this conversation, from these negotiations, they are ready to accept the result and not to immediately start complaining about what is left.
Yeah. I would like to ask you also, coming back to the countries, I would like to also ask you about your observation about the good practices, good actions which were taken by some of the countries in the past years. That could be a good example for Poland and also other Central European countries. I'm talking about some solutions for the energy sector, some solutions for different sectors, maybe some for the agriculture. So because I know that you have a broad scope of many of the countries, meeting with the representatives, also participating in the discussions. Maybe you can even mention what we can do.
Well, as I said at the beginning, it's a global problem. So it has to be tackled globally. But there is one great but. This but is called adaptation to climate change. And this is by definition locally determined action. So I think that there are many good examples on how to adapt, on how to finance adaptation, which probably is nowadays a very important and challenging issue, because with mitigation we have quite easy to comprehend measure of how successful we are in mitigating, because it's being measured in tons of CO2 emitted or not emitted. It's, by the way, good to realize that more we emit, more inefficient we are. Every emission, every waste is a measure of our inefficiency. But coming back to your question, the issue is how to make sure that adaptation action, which is climate action by definition, the adaptation action is very bankable. Let's call it this way, because emissions translate into money. Adaptation, unless we adapt, unless we have adaptation plan, we cannot properly manage risk. So adaptation is very much linked with risk management. And it applies both to businesses and authorities. If we are ready to face the devastation coming from some extreme weather events, we can better respond to this extreme weather events. We can better prepare ourselves, and we can help people to cope with the devastation of other losses. This is, by the way, inscribed in Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals that were agreed in the UN in September 2015, which are sometimes called 2030 Development Agenda.
Yeah, the goals which are very often referring to.
I know you asked me the question, what could be a good example for us, for our part of Europe? Everything could be a good example, because we can find some inspiration in actions taken, everywhere. There are but this adaptation action needs to be kind of tailored to fit the needs of specific region, specific country, specific economy, specific way of living. And we have simply to remember, adaptation is about risk management. So if we are well adapted, we probably be paying less for insurance. Probably our level of risk, if we want to accept some risks, so our risk retention we could accept more if we are better adapted. If we want to transfer whole risk to insurer, for instance, then it would mean that we would probably pay less premium for the policy.
In my opinion, what you said about the like a local adaptation, regional adaptation is very important, because we are like in a really different place where Italy is, or Spain, or Greece. Yeah, we have visited. I visited Greece 2 weeks ago, and they have a really huge challenge with water and water resources. But I think we can learn from each other. Also, having a platform for international cooperation.
Even education, that must not be forgotten, because education is part of every climate action. People have to understand and accept why we are doing that. If they don't, they won't engage.
Exactly. We are in our very interesting discussion. We are coming to the last part, which is raising awareness and education, and also based on your experience and observing for the last many years, how for example Poland has changed, or other countries in the Central Europe, like for the last 30-40 years. And also I know that you discussed probably many times about how to educate, how to raise awareness of citizens, how it should be done. I mean, how it should be, how the knowledge should be transferred, and also how the people should be able to change the mindset, or appropriate narrative. Broad question, but maybe some tips.
Well, first of all, about the change. Well, there is a huge change. I remember 2009 COP15 Copenhagen, and Polish journalists chasing us and not really knowing what to ask. They knew something important was happening, because newly elected US President Barack Obama was to attend this conference. Our Prime Minister was to attend this conference, so the journalists were very, very interested, but they really didn't know what to ask. And when we started just explaining the importance of climate change, they were not interested at all. They were interested with questions: who met with him? 4 years later, in 2013, when we had COP in Warsaw, it was much better. We had Mr. Edwin Bendyk from Politica. He is now the head of Batory Foundation, but at that time he was an editor in Politica, just dealing with this climate environmental agenda. Maybe somebody else from one or two newspapers added something. Well, what happened 5 years later in Katowice, and what is happening now, that we have this climate issues, sometimes a little bit over-exaggerated. Because when you say climate crisis, some people say, well, if it's crisis, let's do something quickly. Some people say, if it's crisis, we cannot help it, so let's better do nothing. And there is another group of people, particularly young people, who get depressed. And this is what we see. So we found the way to address the issue and to reach out to wide society. So we know how to frighten this white society, but we still don't recognize that building new and more resilient infrastructure is a climate adaptation. That development of better managed energy system, it's both adaptation and because it's resilience, and mitigation because we are mitigating, we are just changing the structure of our energy mix. So that's the issue that needs to be remembered. I'm not happy with the way people are educated at schools, because I think it's either kind of a little bit hysterical climate crisis. I'm not saying there is no crisis. There is a crisis, but it's not the main issue here. The main issue here is to stop doing stupid things, adapt, and start developing, because climate agenda is development agenda. And if somebody does not believe me, please read Article 4 of Paris Agreement. This is about sustainable development. If you read Article 6 of Paris Agreement, it is about cooperation between countries to better developed, to act jointly, to deliver climate benefits. If you read Article 5, it's about biosystems and enhancing intake of carbon, and carbon is CO2, not coal, intake of carbon from atmosphere. By the way, there is no word coal in Paris Agreement, and the word carbon appears only 3 times in Article 5. Mm-hmm. It's about making sure that the world keeps developing in a sustainable manner, and peaceful manner. That's why some people were saying that Paris Agreement is a chance for peaceful development of the world. This is why it is so important to think of it as of the chance. There is a Chinese saying that is defining crisis. Crisis is some kind of disaster, but also an opportunity. And we must not waste good crisis for just getting depressed and for discussions instead of using it to act.
Definitely. So my last questions will be also about the crisis which we observe in agriculture. I'm talking about the demography which influence. I'm talking about the labor availability for the farmers. So if you can prepare and send one message to young farmers, also transferring them the knowledge about the climate change, about the actions which they can take, also implementing the carbon farming practices. What it could be from your from a position of the person who knows the broad picture of all of this.
Who saw the broad picture? Maybe I'm not sure if I can say that I understood everything, and I don't think anybody can say that. But I heard many people and I saw many places. And doesn't matter where, if it's India, China, Eastern or Western Africa or South Africa or Caribbeans, it's always about the same. It's about availability of water, it's about fertility. It is about minimizing the use of chemicals that could be replaced with natural ways of farming. So I would risk saying that the farmers keep the keys to the future sustainable and secure development. Because if the farmers just implement all those sustainable procedures, if they take care of the health of the soil, if they develop good practices, these good practices will be copied everywhere. The adaptation measures, whether we need these or that, these are determined locally. But farming practices are exactly the same everywhere in the world. The problems are exactly the same in the world. Okay, some pests could be different, but the concept is the same. And implementing this concept would be hugely changing people's mind. So I would risk saying that the farmers, who are the people who in their everyday practice are in conversation with atmosphere, with biosphere, with geosphere and hydrosphere, are in the center of climate system. And they hold the keys to this climate system. And whether this climate system will continue to lose the balance or will be brought back to the balancing between all these spheres. And that would be my message to farmers.
Tomasz, it was really great pleasure to speak with you, to discuss, to know your perspective, and based on your experience to get some insight. And also I'm really happy that you as our listeners could participate in this discussion, and I hope for another continuation in the future. Many thanks, Tomasz.
That was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.